Well, good evening. It's great to have so many of you out tonight in this setting. Welcome to our conversation with Abe Dueck, author, historian, academic dean emeritus of Canadian Mennonite University. Welcome to the launch of his book, Mennonite Brethren Bible College, A History of Competing Visions. It's good to be able to celebrate this launch together. My name is Arlen. I'm the director of Common Word, a national Anabaptist bookstore and resource center jointly operated by Canadian Mennonite University and Mennonite Church Canada. We're grateful to be hosting this event and glad that so many of you close by and much further away have been able to join us. Tonight's conversation is being recorded and will live on Common Word's website and be available to those unable to be here in real time. So I welcome future viewers to this conversation as well. And if you prefer, for privacy reasons, you are of course free to turn off your video. But please make sure that your mic is muted, remains muted, so that there is no audio interference. If you need to be in touch with me during the evening or have a question for Abe, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And toward the end of the program, there will be a question and answer period, and I'll reserve your questions for that time. Jon Isaak, the director of the Center for Mennonite Brethren Studies in Winnipeg, together with Abe, have planned a special one-hour evening. In addition to Abe's own overview of the book and input, several other guests will give feedback and offer a set of issues from their vantage points and have Abe respond to those. Paul Tiessen, Professor Emeritus in the Department of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, is joining us from Ontario. Welcome, Paul. And Cheryl Pauls, current president of Canadian Mennonite University, is joining us here from Winnipeg. Welcome to you as well. But before they speak, I will ask Jon to unmute and introduce Abe and give a brief context to the book project. Jon.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Arlen, for hosting a Zoom launch like this for Abe Dueck's MBBC book. And before Abe highlights aspects of the book, I'd like to make some introductory comments to set things up for our conversation this evening. As noted, my name is Jon Isaak, and I'm the secretary for the Mennonite Brethren Historical Commission, and that's the group that published Abe's book. And I also had the privilege of working with Abe as his editor and as his producer. It was a lot of fun for me. I'm an MBBC grad myself, and so I found Abe's narration of the personalities involved in the MBBC story so very fascinating. The backstory. In 2016, Abe received a research grant from the commission for his proposal to study the MBBC story, its birth, its development, including its decline and end. And he spent many months in the archives reading all sorts of faculty council minutes, conference proceedings, correspondence, and so on. Now, Abe's subtitle, A History of Competing Visions, really sums up the college story with its push and pull, back and forth struggle, each administration attempting to advance a particular vision of what college education should look like. However, it turns out to be much more than a college story. It's also the story of the Mennonite Brethren Church in Canada. You see, it's a blended family, one that tries to combine evangelical and Anabaptist impulses. And Mennonite Brethren have a long and colorful history of back and forth movement, because evangelical and Anabaptist visions sometimes don't combine easily. And so it's this very colorful history of competing visions that makes Abe's MBBC story so engaging. It's been 5 years in the making, and now the commission is very pleased to release the publication of your book, Abe. Thanks for persevering. Now about Abe. Besides having a specialization in historical studies with a PhD from Duke University, Abe studied at MBBC and then taught there for 23 years, with 15 of those years as academic dean. And this meant he was part of the inner circle of the college administration for many years. And it also means that readers of his book are assured of a balanced and insightful analysis of the almost 50 years, that's 1944 all the way to 1992, that MBBC both shaped and reflected Mennonite Brethren life in Canada. So Abe, please, why don't you set out for us some of the high points of your findings, and then Professor Paul Tiessen and President Cheryl Pauls will each give their responses, followed by an open question period from the Zoom audience. So over to you, Abe.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction, and thank you, Arlen, and both of you for making this occasion a possibility. I appreciate that very much, and I also appreciate very much the number of people who have signed in and registered. I wish I scrolled through the list a little bit, but I can't. I would like to talk to a number of people, specifically people whom I haven't seen for years and years, and it's truly humbling to see some of you. I hate to mention names, but I saw among them my roommate Ray Brubaker, with whom I roomed in Goshen College many years ago. So welcome. Beyond that, I should name others, but I'll just leave that for now. John has already mentioned some things that that I wanted to say by way of introduction. One of them being that although it is in history, intends to be a history of MBBC, I have tried to put it very much into the context of the broader life of the Canadian Mennonite Brethren Conference, and to some extent even beyond that, including the North American institutions and conference. Much more could have been said about that, but at least I tried to some extent. John has also mentioned some of the more personal matters. As an insider, academic dean for 15 years, and as such, of course, I was part of board meetings generally. I was part of interinstitutional meetings. I was part of most of the Canadian Conference conventions during those years, and even years when I was maybe only on the faculty. So that, as John said, that gives me perhaps an insider view, which may in some respects be a liability rather than a strength. It's a tricky thing to be an insider and talk about these things, and sometimes quite critically, of course. I want to say, however, that I have appreciated my time at MBBC very much. It's been a very rich experience for me. I could say much more about that, but time will not allow me to say some of the things that I would like to say and still provide room for responses and that kind of thing. So I won't give a detailed overview of the book. I'll just say that most of it is done chronologically, with a chapter devoted to each of the presidential administrators, and then some other chapters, one which is a kind of a wrap-up chapter, a history of the the competing visions, if you will, and some of the complicating factors that relate to that. There's also a short chapter on Concord, those roughly 8 years of Concords that follow MBBC, and the transition to CMU, which I think needed to be there, even though that's a new institution. Now, proceeding to the kind of the main substance of the book has to do with the competition between the various models of institutional models. One being the Bible school, another one being the Bible college, the seminary, and a liberal arts kind of vision, or undergraduate university or general education. The term liberal arts is the one that was used most frequently in the documents that I read. But the term liberal itself sometimes has connotations for people that may be unfortunate, but that's the language that was generally used. The Bible schools, of course, were a strong entity in the early years, especially in the 1930s and 40s. In total, there were roughly, well, 18, as I understand, 18 Bible schools that were formed in various parts of the conference. Some of them initially run essentially by individual congregations, the larger ones, perhaps by societies, and eventually by provinces and the like, so that they evolved over time, of course. Many of them eventually became Bible colleges and had their own accreditation, often with AABC and the like. So that's one of the models of education that Mennonite Brethren in Canada in particular, not so much in the US, had. And of course, there was a little bit of that prior to the Canadian experience. The Bible College was referred to initially, as when people were looking for that kind of institution, as a higher Bible school. So that name, of course, did not last. Eventually it was named Bible College, but still that tells you something about it. It was there essentially to prepare leaders, missionaries, preachers, church leaders, that kind of thing, for the Canadian conference as a whole, and of course missionaries to go abroad, and also to some extent to be teachers at the Bible school. So that was the next level as it was conceived. Now, the top level, of course, was the seminary, and seminaries, especially other than mainline churches, were not prominent in Canada for a long time. There were many seminaries that developed in the US, and Canadian students eventually attended seminaries. Even Tabor College had a seminary division starting in about 1934, I believe. Now, one way of looking at these models, I mean, especially in the 1980s, I think it was Abe Conrad who used the term the tiered structure of Canadian MB education. Now, I don't know that that word was used prior to that, but there was that conception that there was one lower level, the Bible school, and then the college, and then the seminary, to make 3 levels of education, and that they were quite distinct. And yet they weren't entirely distinct. And of course, as I said, the Bible school evolved into the Bible college, or many of them, a number of them did. The Bible college, for its part, in its initial years, was there to train preachers and church leaders, which later became the seminary function. So it at the upper end, it bumped into the seminary concept. And in fact, during the 60s, of course, MBBC had a seminary division, which wasn't very successful and was discontinued in the early 1970s. But there were still seminary courses and there were arrangements that were made with seminaries and the like so that seminary education wasn't altogether absent from the Mennonite Brethren Bible College. The one model of education that doesn't fit these three in terms of the tiered structure of education was the liberal arts or undergraduate university program. And virtually from the beginning, MBBC was involved to some extent in that. Partly it was rationalized or understood as undergirding the main program of educating leaders and that kind of thing. So courses like history or even German for that matter, and other courses, philosophy, were intended to kind of supplement and to round out the theological education. But beginning around 1960 or 61, the affiliation with Waterloo Lutheran University began, and for the next number of years, there were two separate catalogs issued, one the Bible College catalog and the other College of Arts catalog. So there were two very distinct institutions. Partly that was because Waterloo University, Lutheran University insisted on that. They didn't want to be affiliated with a Bible college, but with the liberal arts division. So liberal arts or general education became a very distinct, it was considered a very distinct kind of program, which fed into further education, even though it wasn't a complete program that graduated people in BA or something like that. And then beginning in 1971, of course, the association with the University of Winnipeg continued that, but made a number of additional possibilities there. So that model did not fit the others, but it was always there as something to be considered, and sometimes in a very formal way. And in Ontario, for example, when Conrad Grable came into existence, Mennonite Brethren were, in Ontario, Mennonite Brethren were involved in the discussions, but MBs pulled out of that. I want to say something or read parts of what I have to say about the liberal arts, which were there as an issue of dispute throughout. And perhaps that will speak a little bit to what eventually happened with the formation of Concord first and then CMU. The liberal arts, kind of self-standing liberal arts institutions was never supported by the MB constituency. And why not? Why was the concept of a liberal arts institution so controversial with Mennonite Brethren, when Tabor College in the US was more readily accepted in that constituency? Given the perceived overlap with the Bible schools on the one hand at the lower end and the reluctance to venture into a full-fledged seminary program on the other, the only uncontested program might have been liberal arts program, but that was not one that was easily sold to the entire constituency for a variety of reasons. Young people were already finding an easy transition to the secular universities that had well-recognized degree programs. Christian liberal arts colleges were not an accepted part of the Canadian landscape, in considerable contrast to the situation in the US. In the US, there was considerable, pardon me, in the US, there were already many Christian liberal arts institutions, both private and denominational. Accreditation of these institutions was much easier for a variety of reasons. But Canadians, the situation in Canada was altogether different, and Canadians had access to the public universities. There were VCF programs. I remember when I was at UBC, a very lively VCF program. I think even Vern Ratzliff was connected in running that. And I think quite a number of MBs and other Mennonites were involved in that as well. So Mennonite Brethren probably felt better about leaving the Christian teaching, supplementing their secular education with that kind of thing, rather than having to develop their own liberal arts institution. I would say also that Mennonites have a long history of a somewhat paradoxical attitude to education. The utilitarian function, I think, was easily accepted. You know, if you go into economics or some other career-oriented program, that was fine. But to take philosophy or major in philosophy and that kind of thing, that was not something that was easily sold to Mennonite Brethren. I see my time is running quite along. There were, of course, besides the competing visions for education, besides that, there were complicating factors. One was nationalism. If you look at what happened in the North American context between US and Canada, much could be said about nationalism at that level. There was provincialism, and that exhibited itself especially in a kind of between Manitoba and British Columbia, and especially because over time British Columbia had approximately half of the membership, or more than half of the membership, of the Mennonite Brethren constituency in Canada. There was also regionalism. Here within Manitoba, there was competition, if I can put it that way, between Winkler and MBBC, and not always the most positive feelings in that regard. Demographic issues were certainly important, as suggested by the membership in BC. The other provinces, the shift wasn't as noticeable. Then there was, of course, the theological issues. Anabaptism played a stronger role, especially in the earlier years, I would say, and perhaps throughout its history in the MBBC context than in the Bible schools, the regional and provincial Bible schools. Anabaptism, evangelicalism, John referred to that, fundamentalism, eschatology, those kinds of issues arose from time to time and created some competition or dispute and even perhaps almost animosity at times. The music program was another contested program. Classical music was very prominent at MBBC as well as at CMBC. And in the 1970s and 80s, of course, there was the rise of more popular forms of contemporary music, and Bible schools were into that earlier than the college, and that created some tension as well. Interdenominationalism was another one. With CMBC would have been one thing. Already in the 1940s, there were gestures made to do a college, to create a college together, but that did not come about. There were times when there were discussions with other denominations, not only Mennonite, but also Nazarene or Alliance Church, that kind of thing. And of course, the issue of resources, finances, was a major issue that created hardship. My time is maybe almost up. Is that right? I see nodding. Well, the chapter entitled "A History of Competing Visions" is something that I had thought I would cite a little bit, but maybe enough has been said for others to respond, Paul and Cheryl, and maybe the larger responses from others will keep us going for the hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Abe. Paul, I'll turn to you.
I'm just unmuting. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I wanted to say thank you to Jon Isaak and Arlen Friesnep, Common Word Bookstore at the Canadian Mennonite University, and certainly to Hildy, who's here with me and helping to run this Zoom apparatus. It's a pleasure to be here, also with Cheryl Pauls, president of CMU, which we are learning is our ultimate destination at the end of this book. And it is a pleasure to be here with Abe Dueck, to whom and to Kindred, congratulations on publishing this important book, Mennonite Brethren Bible College, A History of Competing Visions. Or what strikes me also is that it might sometimes feel like a history of shifting ground or a history of shifting figure and ground. I should confess that Abe and I have written about 40 emails to each other over the last 3 years. He has been helping me with ideas and details for a book that I am writing on mid-20th century Mennonite Brethren culture and the arrival there of the editor and novelist Rudy Wiebe. Jon Isaak has asked me to make some kind of brief reference to my home environment here in Kitchener-Waterloo. And I will mention briefly its historic links to MBBC. As teenagers growing up in the large MB Church in Kitchener during the 50s and 60s, my buddies and I experienced the energy and exuberance of Sunday school teachers and youth leaders, of theater directors and choir leaders and others, all of these enlivening the texture of our church experience. I'll give you just sample names: Harold Jantz, Katie Funk-Wiebe, Jack Dueck, and of course, many, many more. And the same was happening just down the road at Waterloo MB Church. I'm thinking here, of course, of those many MBBC students who were here in town studying at what was called Waterloo College until 1960, and then Waterloo Lutheran University, 1960 to 1973. And then it became Wilfrid Laurier University. Quite a number of those students had lived in the White House. Some of you will remember it at MBBC. Here in Kitchener-Waterloo, many found a parallel home base, 10 Spring Street in Waterloo. I remember the address well. No doubt students such as these had an impact on kids in our Kitchener youth group. After all, about 12 or 15 of us, just from our church, were off to MBBC in the mid-1960s, a stimulating time for us all. There we learned how to socialize among other MB folk, how to enjoy the big city MB vibe of Winnipeg, the productions of the Mennonite Symphony Orchestra, and that year an MB winner of the Rose Bowl. And a real plus, when we got back to Kitchener at the end of that school year, people in our church would nod and say they were impressed that we had learned how to shake hands in Winnipeg. As Abe Dueck makes clear, the Mennonite Brethren College of Arts was formally linked to Waterloo Lutheran University throughout the 1960s. But what I have found is that Russlander Mennonites had, since the 1940s and 50s, made very strong positive impression on the faculty and the administration at Waterloo Lutheran. Some very bright students, going all the way back to the impact of Reverend H.H. Jansen's 12-year leadership of that somewhat historically oriented liberal church, take that word, Kitchener MB Church, made important waves here early on. What the WLU people called these Russian Mennonites from the local community were, as one report puts it, among our very best students. And along with our pastor, Frank Peters, who lectured at Waterloo in the early 50s, they easily prepared the way for the university's official MBBC connection throughout the 1960s. Well, Abe Dueck does point rightly to limitations of this connection in his book that carried MBBC through the 60s. But I do want to say it was also a very exciting and stimulating and rewarding time for the MB churches in Kitchener-Waterloo, and I think for students studying in both Winnipeg and in Waterloo. And of course, there were those profs who followed the students and came to teach at Waterloo, Harry Lowen, Victor Martins, both from MBBC and also from FC Peters, who became president, who in fact transformed Waterloo Lutheran into Wilfrid Laurier University. So Abe, congratulations. I have 4 questions that come to mind. You don't have to answer any of these, just kind of, you know, I'll put them out there. And speaking of it, Frank Peters, how come, after I read your book and see all the presence of Frank Peters strewn through the book, how come the energy and the charisma and eloquence of Frank Peters, with his pretty strong vision at times for a liberal arts environment supporting a theological environment, how come it didn't carry more weight, more momentum? After all, this is the guy, Frank Peters, who brought the idea of the coffee break to MBBC when he arrived there around 1957. I'm quoting David Abert on that. Second question. Do you think, and this also sort of grows out of what I sensed in all those students who poured into Kitchener-Waterloo, dozens upon dozens from MBBC, might the insight and the sensibilities and the commitment of MBBC students, rather than always the constituency, which seemed so powerful, might students not have carried more weight, especially when the college was registering such success based on student interest, for example, in music? And in fact, as I read your book, I sense that the success of music at times turned out to be more of a liability than a kind of a positive force. More specifically, Abe, are you writing this down? Okay.
Trying to. Yeah.
Very quickly. In 1971, I did publish a quite positive account of Victor Adrian's vision, which Abe quotes from on page 88. But in light of his book, and in light of the near constant movement toward liberal studies, it seems to me that Vic Adrian, who was one of my favorite teachers at the college, that he was working in far greater isolation from others than he was letting on at the time. And I was very struck and interested by the extent to which he at times seemed to be blindsiding faculty or board or the conference and so on. So I'm curious about your sense of where Vic Adrian either took things or didn't, where he got it right or where he got it wrong. And a related question, question 4, my last question, to what extent did the overlapping of Vic Adrian's vision with that of the board chair, Jack Block, and his relatively negative analysis of MBBC have a sort of negative multiplier effect when those two brothers were overlapping? Those are my thoughts, and those are my questions. And on to Jon or Cheryl.
Good evening, and what a joy and honor to be treated by the look of all these faces and names. Welcome, and just pleased to see all of you. Mennonite Brethren Bible College, A History of Competing Visions, is a good book, good in the sense that its story can be read in more than one way. It is a story of tribute. It is a story of lament. It is a story marked by beauty and pain, conflict and ongoing transformation. An account of communities across church and school with unwavering, trustworthy, honorable allegiance to Christ Jesus, yet whose strengths of vision and conviction came together in ways more repellent than resonant. Communities across church and school whose tenuous resolution and collective vibrancy go on. A story of tribute. I begin not with the story, but the author. Congratulations, Abe, on a fine piece of work. Your account is refreshingly honest, not glossing over pain and confusion, nor wallowing in defensiveness or bitterness. Most remarkably, you offer a critical eye on decisions and directions to which you yourself contributed. Given your own vocation was sacrificed in the closing of MBBC, this is a stunning achievement. I offer tribute to your scholarship as much as your grace. Second, a tribute from alumni. I'm amazed by the riveting story Abe has crafted from meeting minutes. It tells of administrators, faculty, and board caught in crossfires of institutional tensions that they carried personally for decades. Often enough, students caught wind of these conditions, but faculty did not wear the strain on their sleeves in the classroom or community gatherings. Instead, students were honored and cherished as co-learners and received an exemplary education rooted in the love of God, in living relationships with the church, and in outstanding academics. Thirdly, a story of tribute to the Canadian Mennonite Brethren Church. Abe exposes MBBC fragility almost from the start, yet that storyline has a flip side, where there's a fortitude to be honored across difference in church and school, a will that kept trying to name its collective good and that kept up with national funding for almost 5 decades. I accept Abe's account that the name for a while, Mennonite Brethren Bible College and College of Arts, denotes a comprehensive vision that was more encumbered than trusted. Still, in citing encounters between MBBC and a board called Spiritual and Social Concerns, later Faith and Life, I read a story of the tension as more about how than if matters of spirit, God, faith, the Bible, and the church are vital to all parts of life and all disciplines of study. Also, the account of a stark swing in the 70s from Victor Adrian to Henry Cron is a story of trying to do much the same thing from different angles. Thus, I'm persuaded the story's debilitating dynamics can also be read as productive tensions. MBBC's comprehensive vision may not ever have gained collective traction, yet in some amorphous way, I think most people got it and yearned for it too. A story of lament. I appreciate Abe's care not to caricature differences as conference versus college, even if often experienced that way. A range of vision always existed both within constituency and within college. And I lament that MBBC was known more as the flashpoint for strains in CCMBC, the Canadian MB Conference as a whole, than as a reconciling nexus. The book's story of lament across church and schools speaks to culture changes in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and on. And as a particular community which transitioned mostly from rural to mostly urban living, and also from colony-like communities to a community church movement in cosmopolitan guise. All this within a denomination that thought it had to name its blend of, to quote J.A. Taves, Anabaptist theology, Baptist polity, and pietist spirit as a singular identity. Add to these factors the changing regional dynamics, shifts in never attained yet ever longed for close-knit system of MB education institutions, and strains of purpose that always plague all post-secondary education. In all, it is not a failing that MBBC eventually underwent a radical institutional evolution. Still, I'm struck by the depth of struggle to find language to connect educating ministry leaders with their initial and final credentials, and who would know something of life beyond the church, educating them alongside other students who would be part of the church across many vocational callings and pursuits. Why was that so hard? A bit on music. Abe describes aptly music as an emblem and also being on the side. It was an emblem, though, of all that was wrong and all that was right about MBBC, fraught with worship and performance expectations and tensions, yet cherished for high quality faculty. Yet I'll highlight another storyline here. There was a short window in the 50s and 60s when the traditions of the MB Church's song, Karen Leader, gospel hymns, and more, and also traditions of Western classical music performance, that both of these merged in the canon of Bach chorales. This merging fostered an easy correspondence across worship and performance on which MBBC thrived. By the 70s, both spheres changed, and they changed at different rates in their central music expressions. And singing across spheres of music in worship and in concert life became more difficult. I know this argument sounds a bit complex, but I tell it to illustrate what I see as some of the tensions in Abe's account as being more about people talking past each other than really disagreeing. And a story that goes on in living form. I consider the closure of MBBC, the end of the college as a national institution of CCMBC, as a tenuous resolution. After all, the same tensions continue to exist within MBs in Canada in many forms. And a church with a commitment to mission and an emphasis on evangelical Anabaptism will always struggle with growing pains and disruptive edges. As these continue, I'm sorry that MBBC isn't there as the national lightning rod to absorb some of the struggle and to channel its energy. Secondly, in my view, MBBC is like a perennial flower whose vision and trans-Canadian scope keeps coming up and infiltrates CMU. CMU today has a more diverse range of partners and areas of study that appear to have settled on the College of Arts vision, or what we might call today the liberal arts and sciences. However, the Bible College part of the perennial is embedded in the very grain of the learning community's mission, that mission of being moved and transformed by the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and in living relationship with the church. Now, in stating this, I take issue with a statement that Abe makes from the David Avert era in the 80s. And I quote, "MBBC risked not satisfying either group. A Christian liberal arts alternative would have provided a clear sense of direction and an identifiable constituency with good student potential. Instead, the college opted for continued ambiguity." I'm actually persuaded by that continued ambiguity. And I trust that CMU will remain vibrant precisely because it accepts the gift of legacy that is not afraid to live in the tension of competing convictions and visions, and in bringing together all manner of faith and life across church and society. Now, I close with a question based in a quote from the MBBC 1945-6 catalog. And I quote here, "MBBC seeks to provide an opportunity for earnest young men and women to prepare adequately for the high calling of Christian service as ministers, teachers, and so on." The language sounds dated, but the meaning of earnest, to be sincere and intense in one's convictions, is an apt way to describe not only the students MBBC sought, but the very lifeblood conviction of the Mennonite Brethren Church. And so I ask this, is there a shadow side in the earnestness of devout followers of Christ that MBs would do well to face? How might a little less earnestness have altered the story for MBBC and Canadian MBs? And to be a little less hypothetical, Abe, have you ever thought about MBs and earnestness? In all, thanks for this fine work. You've provided the roots to see the flowers and the weeds in the perennials that live on.
Well,
Cheryl.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Abe, and feel free. There's several questions on the table, and appreciate both presentations. Feel free to make a response.
I realized, and John indicated that both Paul and Cheryl might have questions, but I didn't anticipate exactly. I didn't anticipate the questions that came. They need a lot of reflection. Thank you both, Paul and Cheryl, for those fine responses. They certainly require a good deal more reflection than I can and I cannot answer. I hope that I can see the text and maybe respond more fully at another time. I'll just say something about mainly one of Paul's things there, questions. I don't have the exact statement, but he wondered about the Vic Adrian era, and I realized that Vic Adrian was very highly thought of in terms of his classroom, very challenging, I think. Even though I never had him as a teacher, I realized as a colleague that he was a very popular teacher. So that creates a bit of a pause as to what that's all about. I came to college for 2 years in 1966 to 68, and that included 1 year as a colleague of Vic Adrian at that point. Then I went off to graduate school at Duke University, and came back in 1971 in the midst of a major crisis when things looked like MBBC might be closed. And I always admired, I think it's fair to say, I admired Vic and found him very stimulating, but it was hard to put the finger on just what drove him in a sense. And of course, it was very difficult, and there were personality issues involved in all the crises, and it's hard to kind of reflect on what all constitutes, what all the dimensions are in some of the struggles that were there. Not everything is part of conference dynamics. Certainly there's much that is of a much more personal nature, and that perhaps is highlighted by that one. Cheryl's questions about, and quoting my statement about ambiguity, I wish I had that statement in front of me. I think that I would have to reflect on more fully exactly how to respond to that one. And rather than attempting to do it here at this point, I think I would be open to hearing what comes on the chat lines.
Okay, thank you. We've heard from Paul and from Cheryl. It's your turn to offer a comment or question to Abe. Feel free to do so by adding that to the chat at the bottom of your screen, or by choosing to raise your hand by using the raise hand feature, and I would call you to speak. So I invite that now.
There's a question, Arlen, from Jon Pauls. I don't know if you see it there.
Yes, I did now see it. Thanks, John. Yes, Jon Pauls writes, thanks for writing the book, Abe. I'm getting a basic sense of the regionalism and provincialism. Could you say a bit more about the nationalism that contributed to the competing visions that you are naming at MBBC?
Certainly. The Mennonite Brethren arrived in the US in the 1970s, of course, and while there were some Mennonite Brethren in Canada before the turn of the century, the largest influx came in the 1920s. And so there were very different histories. You have approximately, 50 years of history that separated the two groups. So with the development of Tabor College and so on, it is parallel to some extent with what happened with the missions program as well as the periodical program. Nationalism eventually resulted in separate, in terms of missions, there was the creation of an Afrika Missionsverein because the Canadian MBs didn't believe that Americans understood Canadians, and they were making requirements of Canadians which were not appropriate. And the periodicals, the Christian Leader, and before that the Zionsbote, served both constituencies, but Canadians again felt that their needs weren't sufficiently met. And so it's really the same story with regard to education. Tabor College sufficed for a time, but over time, Canadians felt that their needs were not being met by the schools and institutions that were run primarily by the Americans. The conference was divided into 4 districts, Canadians being one district for a time, so 1/4, and they didn't have as much of a voice in things. So nationalism in that sense, and probably in other ways as well, culturally, etc., played into that. So that's a partial answer.
Any others? Please feel free. I'll watch the chat a bit more carefully, John. Or do raise your hand if you want to speak it.
I'm not sure how this works, so
Okay, hi, Royden.
hi.
Go ahead.
Abe, congratulations on a wonderful
Thank you.
passion that seemed to infiltrate every corner of this institution. I was wondering whether you had any nostalgia for a time in the past, it seems, when people cared so intensely about an institution, so much so, you know, they might not talk to one another, or that they would threaten to leave, or, you know, I'm awestruck as an historian about this time of almost the apex of Mennonite institutions. I'm not sure whether you agree with that, but I was just, I mean, I was moved and by that passion.
Yes, do I have nostalgia? Sure, I do. To answer that question, I think it would be good to have more of that kind of strong sense of what we need. And in some respects, I see the Canadian Conference as losing, you know, any kind of cohesiveness in terms of what it cares about. You know, is it better to care about what you don't like? You know, to disagree with what you don't like, at least care about something. Whereas it seems like, it seems to me sometimes that we care about very little in common together. So yes, thank you.
Robert Martins writes, Abe, I'm interested in the music issues. If you could elaborate on that a bit more.
Well, I say it in my introduction or preface, I think that the music program could easily constitute a book in itself, I think, because even now when I've had sessions with others, some people have said that for me, MBBC was music. They came to college because that's what the college stood for. And certainly the music program was held in high regard. I mean, the major contributors to that initially were people like Ben Horch, of course, and then later on Victor Martins and Dylan Erngard Berg and others, many of them on a part-time basis and deserving of note, but I couldn't put everything in the book. So the music program, while it was very popular and drew many students, was also one which alienated some and made the part of the constituency feel that the main purpose of the college was no longer being served. It was for some too performance oriented, not enough geared toward the needs within the congregations. That kind of thing came through actually from a fairly early period. And so it was a controversial program, even though it was highly recommended and highly regarded, not only by students who took the music program, but you know, in Winnipeg in the musical constituency and in Canada, CBC, etc. So it was very highly regarded.
Cheryl Pauls just adds John Martins to your list of names who kept copies of the College of Art stationery in his office long after it was outlawed in the 1980s.
It's always dangerous to mention names. You always leave out some people. don't you?
Partly testimony to the music program. I was not a music student. I was not a student of MBBC. I was a student of CMBC. And so this is a learning for me to be part of this conversation. But all 4 or 5 of the music profs, instructors that you mentioned, I'm quite familiar with, and just speaks of how their influence extended beyond the B circles. Anyone else?
I see
Randy Clausen writes, picking up on the question of nationalism, to what extent do you think the larger story of North American MB dynamics among all its institutions and its personalities be mapped onto the basic Canadian, and Amerikaner and Russlander distinctions?
To what extent? Yes, to a considerable extent, for sure. But as I tried to say earlier, the context in the U.S. was different, generally different, not only within Mennonites, but the educational system as a whole. And also the Mennonite Brethren constituency, because they arrived in the U.S. so much sooner, was at a very different place by the time MBBC came into being. In 1954, J.A. Taves refers to the 1954 conference as, what is the term he uses anyway, crisis, a turning point, a major turning point between the 2 constituencies. Prior to that, there were discussions about a joint seminary and doing more things together. And the Canadians objected to that and decided to go their own way, even though, I mean, MBBC already existed, of course, but in other respects, they no longer wanted to support Tabor College. And of course, Fresno Pacific arose about the same time as a Bible school, Bible Institute, and about the same time that MBBC started. So there are aspects that can be put into a similar framework, but there are also very distinct differences which could be elaborated on to a greater degree, I'm sure.
I'm going to leave Tamara's question till the end, but Dan Balzer writes, which era of MBBC's history do you think was most influential in inspiring Anabaptist values and behaviors in its students?
Great question. I'd list 2 eras, actually, if I may. I mean, certainly J.A. Taves, Jon A. Taves, who was president for a number of years, was very important in that regard, and was known as the person who really put Anabaptism on the map for MBs generally. And he worked together with people from other conferences, especially also with the Bender School of Anabaptism. So J.A. Taves was very much identified with that. Henry Cron, of course, was also known for his emphasis on Anabaptism. And among students, I think when they reflect on Henry Cron, they would certainly see that as a major contribution of Henry Cron. The wider, Henry Cron didn't have as much influence, I think, on the wider constituency in that regard as J.A. Taves did. But for students, I think he had a significant role.
And Andrew Dick writes, you appropriately chose to write about leaders and issues and faith and politics and so on, rather than writing much about the life of the students. Were you to focus more on the kinds of students and their experiences of the college and how the college shaped them, what would be some key themes you'd want to examine?
I've thought a lot about that and decided that that was something that I was probably not a strength of mine, or that would take an awful lot more work to see just how students would respond to their experience at the college. I think a lot of interviewing of students would have to be done. And when students who have read the book and faculty members who have read the book and responded to me, actually both have often commented that they didn't know that this was going on, or much of what was happening they weren't aware of. A group of students got together in 2010. I think John Longhurst organized that, and that was largely a group of students from the Henry Cron era. And for students, that was a very dynamic era in many respects, I think. Perhaps one of the most dynamic eras. But for the college as such, the conference, it was a much more difficult era. So that would take a lot of work, and I would certainly think that would be important to know, but I don't think I'm qualified to deal with that adequately.
Terry Smith, an alumnus of MBBC, writes a statement of appreciation and how MBBC played a role beyond direct Mennonite Brethren circles. He writes that he followed in the steps of at least 2 EMC ministers who went to MBBC after studying at Steinbeck Bible College and at EMC College. I am grateful for gaining an MB perspective on evangelical Anabaptism, a challenging a marriage term can be. Thank you, Dr. Dueck, for exploring that marriage in your book.
Thank you very much, Terry. And of course, I remember Terry very well, and we've had some interactions in more recent years. The connection with the EMC church or conference was for many years a rather important one, even to the extent of having a member of the EMC church or one of the people on the board. That never developed into anything significant, and I think to some extent it was also because Steinbeck Bible College was evolving to a greater degree, and perhaps some of the same things that developed between the college and some of the MB Bible schools. With the evolution of the schools, things kind of went in different directions.
I need to ask Tamara's question. What was the most enjoyable part of writing this book?
It would be easier to talk about what was least enjoyable, maybe. That's not to say that there wasn't a lot of enjoyment. I certainly, I mean, living so many years of my life in that, certainly looking at the records and so on, apart from some of the controversies per se, reliving the energy that was there. I think as a member of the faculty, I certainly experienced a lot of energy. I could go on at length with that, and maybe students didn't always appreciate that, or at least realize to what extent that was there among the faculty. So reliving that and my connections, which were very, very invigorating and energizing, that was a good experience for me.
Dora Dueck and the rest of us are asking what was the least enjoyable?
Well, the periods of tension, some of them affected me personally more so than others, but certainly the least, or the dissolution or the end of MBBC was a painful period for many of us. And so that was perhaps the most difficult, although I was there in the early 1970s when we were almost at the point of closing the college, but the pain wasn't as personal in that respect as the pain around the early 1990s and trying to sort the way through that. And I know others felt the pain too, and that's just the way it was.
We'll give a few more minutes if there's still a comment or two, question that remains. I've enjoyed this conversation. Hope you have as well.
Hi, hello.
Yes.
I'm John Friesen, and I want to thank Abe for the book, which I very much enjoyed. I was on the Board of Higher Education when Jack Block had a board meeting, which included the discussion between Dave Ewert and Vic Adrian. And I observed that and was simply overwhelmed by the problems of relationships between those two people. So the question is, that was raised, why was the conflict not productive? Why did it result in negative understandings in the long run? And I was also the evaluator of Henry Cron's production, or Henry Cron's presidency, when he was finally released from his position. So I come from this as a person concerned about conflict resolution. In my view, the reasons for the problems of the college had to do with inadequate conflict resolution strategies. I think that conflict could be highly productive, but it wasn't. And largely because people didn't collaborate. They rather presented their view without listening to each other. And I'm wondering what your point of view, what your position is regarding that.
Yes, certainly some of the skills of conflict resolution weren't there. And I suppose that was more generally true with regard to conflicts in the church throughout, that those mechanisms weren't there to the extent that they were there in earlier years. And yes, John, I remember very clearly your presence there during that time. You said that Henry Cron was let go. I think the official record wouldn't put that way. It wouldn't be, doesn't say that in that way. But in any case, I agree with you that the mechanisms weren't there adequately. I think the issues between Vic Adrian and David Ewert were resolved in the course of time, in the next 2 years. Whether you're aware of that or not, I don't know, but I think there was some resolution of that. That's my understanding.
That's wonderful to hear, because back in those early years when I served on the board, there was much debate and misunderstanding between those two people.
Yes.
Abe, what might have surprised you in your research?
Yes, I saw that question, and I've been asked that before. And the last time I was asked that, I said probably not very much. It surprised me. I thought back, and certainly I discovered some things that I wasn't aware of before, but in general terms, I really have to say that there weren't too many surprises, maybe because I had even though I started writing this only about 5 or 6 years ago, I certainly knew the history fairly well prior to that. So, yeah.
John Siebert's comment about writing about student life and is linked closely to marriage and family formation. I know from my own CMBC experience, it's very similar, as known as a bridal college. I get the impression that's what's behind his comment here too. For most of us, it was the most important decision we made in life when we found our spouse.
That's true for me as well.
Could I just make a comment?
Hi, Harold.
Yeah, it's Harold Jantz here. Thanks, Abe, first of all, for the book and for the work that you did. It's an important contribution. One of the things that there are a number of comments about the book in the opening pages, and one that I identified with was one made by Patricia Lowen, in which she said to her, the school had always seemed like a strong institution, and the people who taught there as people who all of them could make a very strong contribution. And I resonate with the thought that we had a large number of people who taught at MBBC over the years who poured their lives into it. I observed MBBC for many years as editor at the MB Herald, and I often interacted with the various ones on the faculty and enjoyed that interaction. And I sensed from by far the majority of the people who were teaching there a tremendous commitment to the school. And then you had this story of conflict, much of which I'm sure the students were not aware of. And that's why I think many students could come through MBBC and really not know that there might be some very serious tensions between some of the people, much of this having to do with the vision for the institution. And I think in some ways it is sad that there weren't better ways to resolve some of these tensions, because these were tensions between good people who really had the well-being of the church, of the Christian witness, if you like. This was at the heart of what they were trying to do. And I think it grieves me that this was the case. But I think in some sense, it doesn't take away from the contribution that many faculty had into students' lives. And perhaps this is the way it was meant to be. I believe, as Cheryl expressed it earlier, a certain ambiguity in the goals for the institution were not bad, because they reflected a reality that existed within the conference. And I think that sort of conflict can be very productive. And perhaps one of the lessons that can be taken away from your book, Abe, is that we should welcome some of these tensions and then find ways of listening to the people who represent the different points of view and see whether we can't find ways of making this a very productive exercise for us. So from that standpoint, and maybe in that point of view, I want to thank you for what you've done.
On the question of conflict, I sometimes wonder about two things. One is how much more conflict there really was at MBBC than other institutions, probably more, but I think sometimes conflict was hidden perhaps more in some other institutions. But the other thing that comes to mind is that perhaps in the early years, the first 10 years in particular, I think there were tensions between faculty members as well. I mean, some of that I mentioned in terms of J.B. Taves and how he felt about some of the issues why he left. But other faculty as well, I think sometimes simply, if they didn't feel comfortable, they simply left. I mean, when Queering left, that was amidst some tension as well. Perhaps H.H. Jansen was one where there was very little conflict, but I think there were different ways perhaps of dealing with conflict or of hiding it in the early years than later. Maybe it was hidden more, I don't know.
Thank you. Not seeing anything else in the chat. We've gone over our hour, and I appreciate everyone's engagement. Thank you. It's been a good evening. Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Paul, for your participation. To Jon as well. Let's give Abe a round of appreciation. And this is how we do it in our congregation.
I just want to add my thanks to everyone who contributed. I haven't been able to answer the questions adequately, but thank you very much, and I wish I could meet each of you individually.
Thank you, Abe. If you don't yet have a copy of Abe's book, it's available to borrow or to buy from Common Word. It's also available to purchase from Kindred Productions. And it's at a special rate, a book launch rate of $20, which includes the GST. Thank you, Abe. It's been a good evening. May we continue to learn ways to engage our history, not only to uncover the past, but to also inform our present and to help shape our future. Thanks for everyone's engagement, for your presence here. I wish you all safety and good health and a good night. Thanks for joining.